come in. We're waiting for you. Thanks for coming. Good soup, right? Yep. I made it myself. Me and a guy that walked into a zoo. No. Well, welcome everyone to the final Speaker and Soup series for this winter. These sessions have been about what are the practical things that can be done to help the government implement its new national drug policy. And to remind you what that national drug policy it says New Zealand's alcohol and other drug problems are first and foremost health issues, demanding compassion, innovation and proportion in our responses to those problems. And this final session is around, well, what can law enforcement do? If that's the government strategy and policy, what can law enforcement do in the public health world? Can law enforcement, in fact, do anything in the public health world? We're hoping to prove that that they can. And not all roads to a public health approach to drugs lead to drug law reform. You know, there's lots of us who do support changing our drug law, remembering it's 40 years old and New Zealand is remains one of the highest users of a range of drugs in the world. That approach hasn't worked, but not all public health approaches to drugs needs to have our law changed. And considering we have a government and in fact a parliament that has zero appetite for any reform, if that's the environment, the political environment we're in, well, what can we do? You know, what can be done in spite of the government's inaction? So we've got two speakers today that hopefully will give us a sense of what governments can do, or what else can be done in lieu of drug law reform. So it's my pleasure. We did have three speakers. Our man from Christchurch was unable to come, and he does send his apologies, but we do have, which leaves us more time for our two great speakers here. In the room, we have the Police Association's President, Gregg O'Connor. Gregg is, while he's been in the union for a while, he is a sworn police officer. He's done undercover work, so I don't know if he put you away. He's trained detectives and he's held command positions within the police. His rank is Senior Sergeant. He's led the Police Association for the last 21 years, and you retire in October? 1 week, 1 month. So Gregg's been the face of the police union for as long as I can remember. 21 years is a very proud stint, and he's been the face of the union. And you'll always see Gregg in the media and at Parliament speaking to the police's interests. And actually, when I was quite new in this job, we were both on a TV show. The TV show's been cancelled now. It was the one that Russell Brown ran on, I think it was TV3. And one of our first interactions was a fight, an argument on screen. That was then, this is now. We have a lot to do with the association, and Gregg and I have had many conversations around the changing nature, you know, what's happening in the world. You know, drug laws are changing all around the world. Police are having to change some of their practices because, you know, there's not so much money now as there used to be. And most recently, Gregg's been visiting some of the reforms that we all know about around the world. Recently come back from Portugal, but has also visited Colorado, and in doing that and in learning from his police colleagues overseas, he has some views. He has formed some views, and he's going to share those views with us this morning. And then on screen is a very good friend of ours, Kris Nyrop, who works for the Public Defender Association in Seattle. That's the state of Washington, if my geography serves me well. Kris is the lead of LEAD. He's the National Support Director of Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, which is probably a very good name to call it because it says what it does. It's all around what can law enforcement do to keep people away from the criminal justice system and refer people to help. He has a long history working in public health. He was the Executive Director of Street Outreach Services in Seattle. He's worked for the Washington State Department of Health on a whole lot of public health issues like HIV, hepatitis C, needle and syringe exchange, harm reduction, and also drug policy reform. So it's the afternoon yesterday where Kris is, and we're going to do a little bit of playing around with the technology so he can see you currently. I'll move the camera so he can see Gregg when he's speaking. But welcome, Kris. If you wave, though, I can see you. There you go. Fantastic. But what I will do first is my pleasure to invite Gregg O'Connor. Welcome, sir, and allow us to muck around with the technology. So if you clip that on, that's so the world can hear you. And so, Kris, right now, you're off screen. So, as I said, if you want to get naked.
Okay.
And I'll mute you as well.
Good.
Over to you, Gregg.
All right, thank you, Ross. And I couldn't possibly compete with that joke, although I will go home and tell my kids it, and I'll get the dad joke call. Look, thanks very much for this opportunity. It's quite serendipitous that it's happening now because, as Ross pointed out, I am moving on from my position. I'm avoiding the word retirement. I'm in an elected position, and every 3 years I come up for re-election, and this year, or 3 years ago, I indicated that I would make this my last term. Everything has got to come to an end at some time. Look, in the time we've got a lot, and I've now got another 10 minutes, so I'll hopefully expand out my notes a little. Just what I'd like to do today is just any decision we make around anything, what I'd like to think we've done at the Police Association is put context around everything. Because so often when you see a debate, whether it be at Parliament, whether it be groups like ourselves, which are pepper groups, we've got well-researched arguments and we know where we want to be. But when we're trying to convince people, when we're trying to bring people along with us, one of the things that's often missing is context. So they'll see us, they'll see someone very convincing, well prepared, and well argued like Ross. But again, so often it's 5 minutes on screen and then nothing else happens. So it's all about education. So can I just, if you'll indulge with me, I think even understanding where we've arrived at in the New Zealand drug context, what I'd just like to do is just go through where we've arrived here briefly, go through what I have learned on my international travels, look at where we are in New Zealand now, what's happening, and just as recently as I think Wednesday night on TV1, you may have seen a news item there where there was the headline was de facto legalisation, where they looked at the number of precharge warnings and the very low number of arrests there are now compared to 1980. I just had some graphs of that. So just start with where we're at with the general drug scene in New Zealand. And I was a police officer here, and this is in my time. I started in 1976, 40 years in police. But before that, there had been something of drugs arrived in New Zealand as a sort of a feature on the scene in the 1960s. I arrived in the mid-70s. And what we had in New Zealand when I arrived as a young police officer here was a massive heroin problem, which people often forget about. And that manifested itself in many ways. And one of them, of course, was that overdose deaths, and you'd come to work and it wasn't uncommon. Could you go to so-and-so has overdosed, Vivian Street, often around the central city. And that was part of policing. We didn't sort of really know anything else as a young police officer. And the other thing, of course, was most of the people we dealt with arrested had some sort of heroin addiction and overnight in the cells trying to deal with that. So again, that's facts. And what I try and do now is think, what did I learn then? There was actually no policy around it, because I remember people trying to implore us that when you get one of these overdose deaths, could you just sort of let us know? Because no one else was watching it. It wasn't as though, and if you went back to the stats over there, no one was really keeping an eye on it. It was just something that grew up and happened. And it was really bad. I mean, if that was happening today, the number of people were dying then. I mean, I remember one week going through 3 overdose deaths in Wellington. Did get a little bit bad. I tend to digress, and I know we've got time limited, so, but later on we can talk about some things that why Wellington had a bit of a bigger problem than Auckland. The next thing, the Mr. Asia syndicate collapsed. And we've all heard about Mr. Asia syndicate, and great stuff and quite accurate. Australia, what had happened, they were New Zealanders, went over to Australia, Marty Johnson and Terry Sinclair. They were very successful, and they subsequently went on to the UK and fell to pieces over there. What they had been was incredibly successful in New Zealand. In New Zealand, most of the heroin was in New Zealand was being brought in by that syndicate. They cleaned out all the opposition either by just marketing or by other means. It was a very violent scene in those days, but they owned the market. So when that whole thing collapsed, a couple of people gave up the whole thing. New Zealand, going to the 80s, from having this massive white powder problem, virtually didn't have a white powder problem for the 1980s. And what we did was actually at that stage, we policed cannabis more heavily, because there was basically nothing else out there. And I was an undercover police officer in 1980-81, and I bought some heroin in Palmerston North of all places. And that was some of the very little heroin that was around in New Zealand at that time. Incidentally, it's when New Zealand's got a very bad name in Australia, because if you did have an addiction in New Zealand at that stage, you either had to go cold turkey, home bake started, or the other thing was that you went to Surfers Paradise or to Bondi Beach, and with the accompanying social and crime problems that come with that. And that was when New Zealand is actually probably quite deservedly, got a bad name with Australians. Anyway, I move on. 1980s was a time policing then, and it was really mostly about cannabis. I wasn't aware of all these other really issues happening. No white powder. 1990s, that was when we had the methamphetamine. And the methamphetamine, sorry, I should be using my, and 1990s on, it's really been methamphetamine. You'll underlay this was alcohol. You could put down the side with alcohol remained a problem, and a major problem right through the whole thing. And if you were doing a graphing, you'd start to look at when we start to liberalise alcohol laws, but it would be quite good to overlay these things. We haven't got time for that today. Anyway, my own education on cannabis was, being a lad growing up going to Buller High School. It wasn't unknown in the school during the 1970s.
Did you
Actually, quite interesting. No, I didn't, because it was one of those things. It was a crowd. It was a crowd thing, because if you're in the in crowd or you weren't, and really most of you weren't in the in crowd then. Probably most of you looking at your schools. Even talking about someone yesterday who's go to Wellington College now. There's plenty of it there, but just because there's plenty of it there doesn't mean plenty of them using it. It still tends to be quite sort of factionalised. In fact, quite interesting. My son and mates went there. They had a normal school education. I remember asking a group of them, would they have smoked a lot more cannabis at school if it had been legal? So, oh yeah, Dad, of course we would have. That was, what a stupid question. So that was actually a little bit of a telling. Anyway, I'll try not to digress and aware of my time limits. And my own education on it was working as an undercover cop, because actually I hadn't really had a lot of exposure. I'd travelled around the world and seen the usual, but and that was some of the things I learned was how prevalent it was, which you didn't even really necessarily see that, having policed in the 80s, how prevalent it was out there. The other thing was the impact on the undercover cops, because the rate of police officers who went out there now, it was all a big lie out there. And I tell you this, is that police officers, whatever they said, police officers were using cannabis. That was the, and we didn't, there was I was sort of a lucky individual who didn't really have, I was a take it or leave it type of a guy. We were taught how to simulate, but we were also taught that don't try and simulate if you think anyone's watching. The police administration had a very real, well, we won't even say this, but what was happening, there's a whole pile of undercover cops were coming back. It was about 25% wastage. People never came back. I didn't realise it myself, people were saying to me, Lag was my nickname, said, you're one of the lucky ones. And it wasn't until later on I understood what they were saying, because I got back mainstream. The expectation was that you wouldn't. So if you went undercover, you'd come back. So that's just another aside, and something probably worthy of a whole session itself, like many of these things. And also, what was a real life to me, I'd seen life through a police officer's eyes, but I really, when I was living all day with people, very bright people, intelligent people who were immersed in the whole scene, I started to really understand quite a big difference between casual use and those who lived the lifestyle, when cannabis was part of that whole lifestyle. And that was, again, part of that whole education. Often you didn't really understand that until later on in life. And then, look, I'll leap forward to, again, on time, it's just what, again, I've learnt from going overseas. We all know about, as Ross said, we all know about the Netherlands, we know about Portugal, we know about Colorado. I'll just take those three. There's plenty of others. I was in Spain this year. I didn't realise it's legal in Spain, basically because they never bothered to make it illegal. That was my understanding. Obviously, you hear these things. I haven't done any study, and you're relying on anecdotal stuff that you think know these things. It's like my old uncle used to say, it's not the pedigree of the bull, it's the pedigree of the man who's selling you the bull that's most important when you look at these things. But the Netherlands, and I'll just go on, I'll just put up 3 slides here that sort of show me the difference between the three of them. Rotterdam, this was in the street, so you see you walk in, you go through the thing, and the barrier through here is where it is. And again, you've probably all seen it. So Rotterdam, and whatever else you hear now, you hear that foreigners can't buy it, crap. You show your passports as you can, as long as you smoke it in the shop. The government tried to say that. They're under pressure from the EU, but what had happened is the mayor of Amsterdam says, hey, 3/4 of the tourism in this town is people coming here to smoke weed from the rest of Europe. We ain't doing anything about it. The mayor of Rotterdam is actually a Muslim. He said, hey, alcohol's our problem. We ain't spending one bit of resource on policing this. So I pulled my New Zealand passport, says, will you sell it to me? Says, yes, the only thing is you can only come into my cafe and smoke what you bought in my cafe. No takeaways or no bring-ins, or what do you call BYO. So that to me just summed that, that's a street scene, that's a mall in the middle of downtown Amsterdam. And you've no doubt talked about this, won't go into that, but the background of how they reached it was because of that whole liberal Dutch that always, again, a lot of the stuff that came through Rotterdam ports, and that was actually why it really became so prevalent, because a lot of the stuff that was coming from the east came there. Downtown Colorado, same thing. That's a shop in the downtown. This is a mall in the middle of Colorado. That's a shop there, and this is again the sign, a blow up of that sign. So the difference in Colorado, you can't see in, particularly in downtown Denver. You're not allowed to be able to see any of that. You can have all the signs outside, but you're not allowed to be able to see in the window. Just the same way when you drive past the factories have got to be closed off so that you can't see in it. So the ordinance, they did a little bit the same over there as we did with the over here with the drugs, the prostitution laws. They left a lot of it up to the local counties. In the southern counties where it's warmer, it's quite different. It's all grown out in the fields, it's all open. In fact, down there, they're trying to grab the market because they're quite poor, a lot poorer part of town. And that's actually what's flooding the market over there. But anyway, that again, downtown, it's quite open but closed off. And the third part about it was Portugal. Well, you can't see it in Portugal. That's a very nice statue, and anyone who's been to Lisbon knows it's very nice old statues. But if you go around looking for a photo of what the policy or what any manifestation of the drug, there isn't any, because quite surprisingly, and I'd expected to see more, but there's very little evidence of drug. You don't smell it as you wander around, like you do in many other cities where it's totally illegal anyway. It struck me. The thing is, those who've travelled in Europe, the giveaway about whether you've got a major heroin problem is usually go to the railway stations, how many people, you can see people who've obviously clearly got heroin addictions. They tend to see them around railway stations. Anyone who's been to Oslo, a real surprise, Scandinavia. I remember I was up there actually researching more on firearm stuff, and I walked out of the railway station there, and in the front of the Oslo station, it is full of heroin addicts. I never would have thought, I didn't understand. And up there, the police have said, we do not police heroin. It is a health problem, and they stay away from it. The city are trying to get the police to do it. The police are avoiding it like the plague, saying because they know when they get in it. Ironically, while I was there, they're doing a massive crackdown on hash because of the Moroccans bringing it in, but nothing on heroin. That was, again, when you go to these places, it's nothing is ever quite as you see it, as you believe it. So again, I just bring that up to give some background to where we come in New Zealand, and again, aware of time. I'll try and and again, the background of these places. Probably Portugal's interesting. So I just go back to Portugal because how you arrive at these places. Portugal, because of the Salazar regime, which was again an absolutely authoritarian regime, they had missed the 60s. They pretty much missed the whole liberalisation, the hippie era, if you call it. And when Salazar went, they had an opening up. The other thing that happened is that, so they didn't really know much about, the police they didn't need to police drugs because it was such a suppressed society anyway. what they had is a lot of their people had been down in Angola fighting a war there and actually bought where cannabis was prevalent. They were bringing it back and smoking it. They didn't even really know the stuff, so they had it there. Heroin was the same, so they ended up with a heroin problem. The difference in Portugal was that because it liberalised, it went right across. It wasn't part of the marginalised society. It was always a mainstream problem. It was always from the wealthy families right through to the families at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. So when they came looking for a policy or a way to deal with it, because they were dealing with the wealthy, the upper end, the high rent end of town people as round at the low rent end of town people, their policies, and again, you'll be aware, I won't go into it, they've ended up with a policy, and the reason in Portugal you still don't see it, it's still illegal. If you walk around smoking a joint in downtown Lisbon, you'll still get locked up. The difference is, of course, you will go into the health regime and a whole different regime. You're not in the criminal justice system. That is the difference, and that's what just with this, and that is thing to understand. It is not legal, and if you talk to the police over there, it's no, we lock them up. If anyone stands there, we're under instruction still to lock these people up. In fact, ironically, I spoke to the mutual friends of Ross and myself, Joe, who was, they tend to pick on the medium users. They don't worry about the high-end users. With heroin, they don't. If you've got it and you're living the lifestyle, you've been through the system. They actually try to pick on the people who are just starting. So you're more likely to end up in the system and under the regime if you're a casual user than if you're a heavy user. Which again, one of these things that are quite different. So I'd better keep moving. Ross, stop me if I'm imposing on someone else's time, because I'd better keep moving. And then coming back to New Zealand. And again, this is coming back probably more related about where we actually are at in New Zealand. Cannabis-related offences dropped to 178, 2005, I've got a graph will show that. Supply-related offences have remained pretty stable at that time, and people imprisoned with one cannabis has virtually disappeared. So it's not just police, it's the whole, there's big changes happening there in the system. You could start to talk about why. Because one of the figures I was trying to get hold of today before I came here was actually what the seizure figures are, whether the actual amount of cannabis being seized reflects that. Because these are the charges relating to cannabis, as I've said, virtually with supply related, slightly down, but certainly over that time since 1980 have come down. These are actual numbers. In 2015, you look at the numbers of people actually possession-only offences. There have been other things that have happened, and you'll talk about later on but what we call tag and release now, actually we have pre-charge warnings. However, cannabis charges seized. This is interesting because you would have thought that with that graph going down like that the amount of cannabis out there was seized, but actually you have a look at those seizures. 2008, there's actually more seized this year than was in 2008. You had a blip in 2009. Don't know because there was an explanation for this. It might have been a bumper year. Who knows? Some of you might remember what 2009 was about.
What was made onto the market?
Pardon?
That doesn't count anything that was made.
No. But this is. But if you're comparing the same things all the time, we conduct our operation the same way. So you compare what you can compare. There'll be all sorts of other things happening. But all this is saying is that with the number of people being arrested for it, there's been no difference in the amount we've been seizing. This is only in our drug operations, not in the general police. What actually happens is every police officer who arrests someone for drug offence, they are supposed and generally do what we call asterisk drugs. So it's a pretty accurate record generally of the amount of cannabis or whatever drug has been seized. Although I am aware from my inquiries for today that apparently it's not been as heavily enforced as it could have been. They're not happy they're actually getting that everyone is now doing it. It used to be you couldn't file a file without actually doing that, but things have changed a little. No, what happens is each district does that. It's run from headquarters, but every year they'll run a drug operation and they'll give them funding. It's separate funding. It's a separate funding from government to do it. You'll understand government funding. It's not just a matter of police don't get a bucket of money. They get this to do this and this to do that, and traffic and various other things. Again, aware that I'm very easily distracted. As every school report that ever came in from me always said, and my son, when I was having him on about that thing, he just hold me up and call me Gregg O'Connor because he had actually got one of my reports. But anyway, I digress. Precharge warnings, and this is the figures I talked about here. Precharge warning brought in 2010. We always had a belief that if you arrested somebody on the street, you really need to charge and put them in the criminal justice system. Government brought in a policy in 2012 that said we want the police to decreased the number of entries into the criminal justice system by 19%. Police overshot greatly, and we brought in these pre-charge warnings. It was great, with people, often all you needed to do, particularly in a disorder situation, get people out of there to stop them fighting. You didn't really need to go through the whole system, but it's a system that has quite overshot. Initially, cannabis wasn't allowed, but cannabis very quickly now, and you see IPCA, and the IPCA just did a recent report, 38% into pre-charge warning, 38% of them are for cannabis. That was why when I saw that, I was interested to see what the actual amounts seized are. And a third of all offence cleared by pre-charge warning are cannabis related. So when you see the figures like those that came out last week, that's what they relate to. I put this up in our, I don't know, Ross, if you saw a copy of our police news last month. This is, we have a cop, we call I Am Keen young cop, who does an article in our police news in-house magazine, which goes to the media. And we give him or her, we don't censor it. We don't say it's our public policy. We say, but you can talk about, and we select people who we think are pretty much in line with what people are saying. This article here was basically about time we gave up. This in particular individual, I had given, to be fair, I had given a copy of Chasing the Scream to read. He was something interested in, so I'm not quite sure how much of this came out of reading that book. No doubt, I see people no doubt have read that, and again, I have thoroughly recommended that book to many people as a full understanding of what really the whole situation is about. And this is just a question that was asked in the interview I did with the Foundation magazine, and I just kind of draw your attention to this. And to me, it sums up as just, in my mind, it's silly to be talking tough about dealing with drug dealers while at the same time becoming more liberal about use. I really do believe as though the two things are somehow unrelated and can be decoupled. So when I see people, and you hear it all the time, say, oh yeah, don't mind a bit of drug use, but we've got to get down on those dealers. So well, hold on, you can't have both. You either, it's the two are not unrelated. But again, that's that real whole political issue that happens. So look, coming back down to, I hope that sort of a bit of a background, and obviously we're going to have a panel conversation, shortly. But I just sum up as that police attitudes, police are not out there chasing cannabis. That's the one thing, again, in preparation to this. But on the other hand, you'll see no written policy. And this is there's nothing written that will say, that you'll be able to point to and say that police have somehow changed their attitudes towards cannabis. Police, of course, are enforcement. What a police officer does out there, they're a part of the system. They're there to enforce the law. And often, and probably in police, it'd be fair to say there's less discretion now than certainly when I started in police many years. We get half the training they get now. We had twice as much discretion when we came out. There's a lot less discretion for various other reasons in police. So summing up, health-wise, what I've learned, yes, I think cannabis is, of all the regimes I was in, Colorado, when I sat there when I came out of Colorado, what it's about, quality control. The one thing when you sit down and think, what have I really seen, is that when you go and buy something, you actually know what you're buying. That's Colorado. Legal from seed to weed, as they say over there, everything's legal. What did I see when I was in Lisbon or in Portugal? Understand there that they've arrived at this, the big difference there, it was a whole societal problem. That's why it wasn't by the time they had to solve it, it was a whole society, it wasn't a marginalised problem. That's how they've ended up down this health path. And in, of course, Amsterdam, well, it's not legal. It's permitted. That's the one thing. When everyone quotes anything that comes from Amsterdam, it's permitted. And the old story, illegal out, there is still no legal source of the cannabis. You can have your whatever grams you're allowed in your shop to sell, but it's taking it out of the car, moving it the back door, it's all illegal. I've tried to get it so there's a legal supply, but of course with the European rules they can't do it. Okay, we've probably got time to expand on that later on, but Ross, thanks for the opportunity.
We're going to do questions. Thanks, Greg. I'm going to unclip you there. Just give me a minute while I set Kris up. Greg, the changing in the the up and down of the seizures can be explained, and has been explained actually by the guy in charge of the National Cannabis operation. It's often down to flying weather. If the conditions, if it's fine and the aircraft can fly more, they can catch more. And if you look at cannabis use in New Zealand, it's gone like this. You get seizures like this, and as you've said, the arrests going like this, and so none of them seem to be.
They tend to go through to their means, though.
Yep.
Today, that's why.
Okay, Kris, you are now on big screen. We can see you, or you can see me. Look at that. Should have shaved this morning. We've got your volume there, good. Police are coming to arrest Kris, and I'm going to pan you around the other way. Gregg's, there we go. And again, so Kris, our friend Kris, has been involved in Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, which is exactly what it says that it is. The police, kind of like Portugal, where the police are channeling people away from criminal justice into health. And it started, as I understand it, I know you're going to tell the story very soon, Kris, it started in Seattle. Kris will talk about some of the evaluations that have been done. But as I understand it, the mood for this model, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, is so great that it's now grown in more states. The White House are really interested in this, so there seems to be a lot of public and political support for this model. So, Kris, over to you, sir.
Great, thank you very much. Can you folks hear me?
Yep.
I'm getting an echo, so.
Okay, well, there's no echo.
Can you hear me this way?
There's no echo at our end. I'll mute our microphone, so that might fix it up.
Okay, how about that? All right, hold on. Apparently I do need these. Does that work?
We're not hearing the echo at our end. It's really good quality at our end.
Okay, great. All right. So I'll just sort of briefly walk you through how and why LEAD came about, and then explain a little bit about what it is and where we're headed with it. So to follow up on some of what Gregg said in terms of history, the state that I live in, Washington State, which is a medium-sized state in the northwest corner of the U.S., like lots of states in the United States, in the mid-1980s, we bought into the war on drugs big time. And so we went to a thing called Determinate Sentencing, which took the discretion on prison sentences out of the hands of prosecutors and judges. And it set schedules at which people would be sentenced for. So your first sentence for a conviction for possession of heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine would be 12 months in prison. Your second would be 24. Your third would be 48, and then it would ramp up to as much as 120 months in jail by your fifth conviction. So 10 years in prison for possession of any amount at all of heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine. And the end result of this was that by the mid to late 2000s, over 25% of all inmates in the Washington State Penitentiary system were in for drug crimes alone. In most cases, just simple possession, not even sales. So we're talking thousands and thousands of people who were being ground up in this system. And the city of Seattle was doing these types of arrests in a really big way. We were generating about 3,000 convictions a year for possession and low-level sales of drugs. And one of the other things that was accompanying this was, in the city of Seattle in particular, enormous racial and class disparity on those who were being arrested and convicted. So in a city where about 8% of the population was black, over 60% of those being arrested and prosecuted for these low-level drug crimes were black. And so there was a lot of contention that was going on. And there was a lot of lawsuits about it, a lot of debate that was happening. And at the same time, we had community groups who were actually asking for more policing. They were filming videos of people using drugs and posting them to YouTube. And there were big community meetings where folks, residents and business owners were asking the police to do more. And this was actually the first time I heard a police officer use the expression, "We can't arrest our way out of this problem," where police and prosecutors were saying, you know, we're at peak jail right now. We are arresting and prosecuting as many folks as we possibly can. What do you expect us to do that is different? So this prompted a series of lengthy conversations in Seattle about what it was that we could do that was different. And the one thing that, you know, everyone disagreed about a whole array of things, but there were a couple of things that people actually did agree on. One of which was that the status quo was clearly broken. It was not meeting anybody's needs. The second thing that people were willing to agree on was the idea of what if we could take what is almost uniformly a bad outcome, getting arrested and sent to jail, and turn that into something that was potentially positive for the individual. And that was an immediate diversion into a harm reduction-based case management program. And so that formed sort of the idea behind Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, which we implemented here in Seattle in October of 2011. So we are coming up on the 5th anniversary of this program. And under the original model for LEAD, it was a post-arrest pre-booking diversion program. So the idea was that the officer actually had grounds to make an arrest for an individual. And when we first started, the eligibility was 3 grams or less of heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine. And I'll just a quick digression here. Cannabis has never been an issue for us. We locally, we stopped arresting people for cannabis many, many years ago. And we joined Colorado with fully legalizing cannabis. So that was not a drug that was of issue for us. So the idea was that the officer would have grounds to make an arrest. And if the person did not have an ineligible, well, a prior conviction for a very serious violent offense, murder, rape, arson, kidnapping, they could have prior drug convictions or low-level crimes, just not major ones. That the officer at that point could say to the person, I've got 2 doors. Door number 1 is the King County Jail. Door number 2 is a referral to case management. If you take the referral to case management, I go away and this arrest goes away. And if the person says, you know what, I would like door number 2, please. The officer calls a case manager and there is an immediate handoff from the police officer to the case manager. And as long as the person completes an intake with that case manager, that charge goes away. And as I said before, it's a harm reduction-based program. So unlike, I don't know if you have drug courts in New Zealand, but unlike more punitive type, I see some nodding. Okay, so unlike drug courts or other things like that, where abstinence is required, abstinence is absolutely not a requirement or even an expectation for folks that are brought into LEAD. What we are looking for is a reduction in criminal behavior and an improvement of quality of life for folks that are brought into the program and for the community that they're in. So as I said before, the original idea was an arrest-based diversion. One of the things that happened almost immediately, and this came as a result of feedback from the police officers that were tasked with implementing this program, was a lot of these officers were coming back and saying, you know, we're out here every single day. We know these folks. In some cases, we might have known them for 20 years. We know what high school they went to. We know what, you know, their family members are. Why in the world do we have to wait until we arrest these folks in order to offer them a referral into a program that might be able to help them? And so as relatively early on, we also allowed for what we refer to as a social contact route of diversion into the program, which is where an officer can just identify someone out in the community who they think might benefit from the program and actually approach them and say, hey, there's a program here that might be able to help you with things that, you know, you might be interested in, such as drug treatment, health care, housing, employment opportunities. Would you be interested in it? And if the person says yes, they can come in that way without even having to go through that original arrest. So we're 5 years into this, and I'll just real briefly talk about what we've learned so far. So because this was the first program of its kind in the United States, we knew we were really under a microscope and that we had to be fairly rigorously evaluated. And so we were very fortunate in that we had an independent team of evaluators from the University of Washington who were also funded by a foundation that had nothing to do with LEAD. So I don't know if this is a term that you guys use in New Zealand, but here in the States we have an expression about not having any skin in the game or not having a dog in the fight. And so that was the case for our evaluators, it was irrelevant to them whether this program was good, bad, or indifferent. And one of the first things that they looked at was recidivism, new offenses. And they discovered that people that were diverted into LEAD were 58% less likely to be rearrested than individuals who were routed through the criminal justice system as normal. So LEAD was actually proving to be, a crime prevention tool in and of itself. People were committing less criminal activity and coming into less contact with law enforcement than folks who were just routed through and sent to jail as normal. The other thing that they looked at was the cost, and this actually didn't surprise hardly any of us here locally. The cost of doing LEAD was phenomenally cheaper than the criminal justice system is normal. Here in the States, criminal justice is really quite expensive. It's actually cheaper to put someone up in a hotel than it is to put someone up in jail. And so this was a finding that we actually kind of expected. The third thing that they've looked at, which was actually quite surprising, was that the LEAD program actually really changed the relationship between individuals who were coming into contact with the program and the police officers who were diverting them. So we've done in-depth qualitative interviews with a little over 20% of the people in LEAD. And when we asked them about, so what was your perception of police before you were diverted in? Time after time, people would say things like, oh, well, Officer so-and-so, mentioning the officer that diverted them, whenever I saw him or her, I would run and hide. But now that I'm in the program, I actually go up to them and I talk to them about, where I'm living and how I'm doing. And if they've got a paycheck, they show the paycheck stub. So it has really shifted that dynamic. So we were the first program in the States to do this back in October of 2011. One of the things that was also sort of surprising to us was the very rapid interest from other jurisdictions in the United States, but also in some cases internationally. But most of it so far has been within the United States. So we started getting phone calls from people after just a few months of doing LEAD. And since we've implemented it, 3 other cities in the United States have completely replicated what we're doing. 2 other cities are doing variations of it. About another 3 or 4 are ready to roll out their own LEAD program sometime in the next few months. And there are about 25 to 30 other cities that are looking at it. And as Ross mentioned, our summer last year, your winter, there was a one-day convening at the White House, and President Obama included LEAD as part of his thing he put out called 21st Century Policing. And so I'll just circle back to something that Ross said at his introduction about getting criminal justice reform without having to change the law. And this LEAD is really a good example of that. So here in Washington State, we did actually vote to legalize cannabis, and that has been good, and it's been quite successful, and it has been well received. But we are a long ways away here in Washington State from ever having a vote that would result in either decriminalization or legalization for heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine. The sentiment is not there yet, and I see a couple of you wearing support, don't punish sweatshirts. And that really is the idea behind LEAD, is that we are definitely operating in a paradigm where these drugs are illegal and where there are still actually severe sentences on the books. Many of our people, if their cases went to trial, they could be looking at 10 years in prison. And I'm talking about 10 years in prison for possession of $5 worth of drugs. And that is the reality that is out there. And we are probably not going to be able to change that law in a way that is meaningful. Some states have been able to, really reduce the penalties, but they're still operating in a system where the police have two options when they encounter individuals who are in possession of drugs or selling them. One option is to either ignore that person, or the second option is to arrest that person. And if those are the only two tools that police officers have, they are going to use one or the either of them. And if the person is a pain in the ass to them, they're going to get arrested. And so what LEAD does is actually give the officer a third option, and it really gives them an option for that person who they regard as a pain in the ass. They can actually get that person off the street right now without having to take them to jail. And I guess I'll just make sort of one final comment here before we open it up for questions or comments. One of the things that has happened is because LEAD is actually giving police officers an extra tool, we have found a high degree of acceptance among our officers for LEAD. When we first started talking about doing it, we were met with complete open skepticism. Officers saying, why in the world would we ever do such a program? But after doing it, and seeing the results that it's getting, their buy-in has been really swift. And so I'll just close with two quick little stories for you. So the first story is from Seattle and it relates to the very first individual who was diverted. So the very first night that we rolled out LEAD, by just random luck, the officer that made the first arrest was an officer who had been the most openly skeptical about LEAD. And she had been saying, the only reason I would ever do this is because I would be directly ordered to do it. Why would I do such a thing? So the first arrest she made that night, she actually recognized the individual. And she took him back to the precinct house and ran a records check on him. And he had 54 prior drug arrests. And she said later, that was when the light bulb went off, where she thought, 55's probably not going to make a difference for this person. And let's try LEAD. And then my second example comes from the second person diverted in the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where this woman has been arrested less in the 2.5 years after her diversion than she was in the 2 months prior to her diversion into LEAD. And this outcome was achieved without having to go through the criminal justice system, but this being dealt with purely as a public health issue that is best addressed as a public health problem by people with expertise in public health and chemical dependency. And with that, I'll go ahead and close it so that you guys have time to ask questions or make comments as relevant.
All right, just bear with us as we snuck around. Gregg, I'll invite you to the stage. Can we turn the lights on? I'll move our little robot here, just so Kris can hear us. That's the microphone so Kris can hear us. This is the microphone so the world can hear us. It's a high quality handheld microphone now. Do you see how that converts from one to the other? And then we've done this before, wrong way. Just so you, Kris, can hear Oh, there we are. Zoom in. I'll sit down. Hi. So the setup now, Kris, is that there's a panel discussion, and then there's Gregg, myself, and you, and we're all, you can picture us all in a row.
Okay.
All in a line. I'm going to dominate the questions for the first little bit, people. I beg your indulgence. And the first question is to Gregg, having heard what you've heard from Kris around their approach. What would your sense be of the New Zealand police, the frontline police's appetite for that kind of model?
I don't think it'd be an issue. It would, a little bit of age. When I was in Colorado and spoke to the police officers there, if you were under 40, you had no issue. Well, and again, going back to cannabis, and again, we do, I know we're sort of focusing a little bit on cannabis here, but I wouldn't imagine that there would be too much of an issue with it at all. Again, as long as the difference with police officers, many others, is they're victim focused, and of course, without drugs, there are no, there's no victim, apparent victim. But although that's easy to say, if the people we are dealing with, as a result of them victimising, we end up finding them with drugs, which is often the case. So it's often not that simple. But if there was an alternative, and particularly looking at it as a way of, you've got a problem here, you can solve it another way, that the criminal justice system. Funnily enough too, you've also got a very police in New Zealand who, through the system, the Precharge Warning system, are very now conditioned, particularly younger police officers, to looking at alternative resolutions.
Cool. And Kris, a question to you, because when we've talked to, New Zealand police, they like the idea, but have expressed frustration around there's nowhere to refer people to help. So, what kind of investment went into LEAD? Did more money go into health to address any treatment waiting lists, or has there been any problems around the lack of health resourcing?
You're shattering my.
Can you hold it up to that?
My illusions of it. So when we started LEAD, we had no national health care. And so that was a huge issue for us. And so in answer to your question, yeah, we actually had to create more of an infrastructure than we had previously. We were okay in terms of drug treatment, but a variety of other services were not available, and we definitely had to increase that. And we've seen that in other cities that we're working with in the U.S., where there does need to be some amount of investment of infrastructure. But one of the things that has happened since we started is that a couple of years ago, we did in fact pass national health insurance, and every one of our folks is eligible under that program, and that pays the cost of their chemical dependency treatment and other health care if they need it.
And then another final question from me. I mean, one of the Gregg talked a bit before around the recent report that IPCA, the Independent Police Complaints Authority, put out around the Precharge Warning, which was around the ethnic disparities. And when the Precharge Warning was first set up, police said, well, we know often that Māori are more likely to miss out on these kind of things than non-Māori, and that was backed up by the recent data out of the IPCA. And there's issues around discretion there. So, Kris, how has, within LEAD, have there been, is LEAD equally applied? Do blacks and non-blacks get the same level of arrest referral?
So this is an answer that's sort of peculiar to Seattle. So as I mentioned before, that one of the drivers behind doing LEAD was the massive amount of racial disparity in drug arrests in Seattle. And so one of the concerns among many of the community members was, what happens if we implement LEAD and suddenly, as a result of coming into contact with police, you get a whole slew of social services rather than jail? Would that change the demographic profile of who got diverted in? And I give enormous amounts of credit to the Seattle Police Department that, in fact, the demographic profile of people that were offered lead was almost identical to the demographic profile of people who had previously been arrested and prosecuted under the previous regime. So in that sense, they actually did divert the same types of folks that they had been arresting before. So it is just to give you a couple of quick examples. This is an overwhelmingly indigent, poverty-stricken population that we work with. So 82% of our folks are homeless at the time of their diversion. 56% of them do not even have legal identification. So this is a really marginalized and disenfranchised group of folks.
Could I just elaborate on those, important those IPCA report? On the surface of it, it did look like it may have been a race-based issue, but what it actually came, many more of the Māori offenders were not eligible because of previous convictions, or so they actually weren't eligible for them.
Do you think in that regard then are there improvements that could be made in the pre-charge eligibility criteria to address that? Is that an easy fix?
Well, I think what the other speaker was talking about around the statistics, your comparators would need to be what it looked like before and what it looked like after. I suspect it would be similar. The other thing you've got to remember is policing. We look, and this is what I go back, long playing record on this with the context thing, because so often people who come to our attention that end up being, arrested for drugs, they've come to police attention for other reasons, and drugs may actually be, and we've actually gone maybe looking for stolen property and found drugs, because that is a reality. So you've got to bear that in mind, that these stats, you never look at them alone, look at them in context.
Yep. Fantastic. We'll open it up to the questions here, and because we've got people live streaming, and I'll repeat the question, so might be an odd thing. So Marilyn.
Hi, thanks. Marilyn from the Nurses Organisation. I wonder, did you measure health outcomes for your people, Kris?
So the question there was, did LEAD measure health outcomes as part of the evaluation?
Could you clarify what you mean by health outcomes?
Well, if you're referring a number of people, did you only refer them to addiction services? Did you find, you said that they had insurance and so they could access other health insurance? I mean, personally, I find if 81% of the people you're arresting are homeless, I'm surprised. I'm not surprised that they're on drugs. What other health, mental health services? We know that people that are, have mental health problems, their physical health issues are much more severe and they're more likely to be in trouble with the law. So all of those things, or did you just measure the interaction with justice?
No, thank you very much for that. That's helpful. So yes, we did in fact look at a variety of things. Some things we were not able to look at for the comparison group because of privacy laws. But so yes, to date, about 56% or so of the folks that have been diverted in, and I should say we started this on a small scale pilot basis. So our evaluation pool is around 400 folks. So it's not huge. It is expanding, but about 56% of those folks have gone through chemical dependency treatment. Virtually everyone has been enrolled in healthcare, and I don't know the numbers of those that have accessed mental health care, but I can tell you it's pretty significant. And not surprisingly, those that have access health care and who obtain housing are significantly less likely to come into repeat contact with the criminal justice system. That's a heavy predictor there.
Other questions? There was one we'll take the question at the back here.
My name's Kate. I'm working in alcohol and drug addictions, and my question is, with this system with LEAD, would that mean that the drug court would that bypass the whole drug court system, or would it be? Because we have a drug court here, which is basically on trial, and I think it's I'm not sure if it's going to continue, but so that would bypass that whole drug court.
So the question, Kris, is around how LEAD may or may not interact with any drug court system you have in Washington.
So the short answer is yes, it bypasses drug court. But because I'm a little unsure of the differences between a U.S. drug court and a New Zealand drug court, let me just say in the United States, in order to get into drug court, you actually have to plead guilty to the offense. And if you fail drug court, then you would get the sentence that you would have gotten. And it's an abstinence-based model. So our idea with LEAD was absolutely to move the whole intervention right to the point of direct contact between police officers and individuals right out on the street without having to involve prosecutors or courts or judges, and to, yes, bypass the entire drug court system.
Question over here.
Yes, I'm a medicinal cannabis grower from medicinal cannabis people. My problem is the gangs keep taxing me or keep robbing me. That's my major problem. I need the law changed.
A question to question to Gregg was around the gangs taxing legitimate medical cannabis growers.
Yeah, look, I go back to my statement at the end, and whatever we do around cannabis policy in particular, if it is going to result in more cannabis being used, which I think most agree certainly in the short term it will, we need to address the supply side as well, because at the moment the supply side, anything that increases supply is just going to increase the influence, wealth and intimidation impact of the gangs. So the only way, interesting in Colorado of course, once they started the legal grows over there, it wasn't so much people from within the state, but it was out of state coming in to do the robberies. So it actually created a bigger problem. But actually that shouldn't be the problem in New Zealand because you haven't got the other jurisdictions on your border. So yeah, look, it's all about, and I agree with you. At the moment, the illegitimacy of the whole industry plays into the hands of organised crime, and that's all the reading. You know, the war on drugs, the failure of all the whole thing in the book, you know, Chasing the Scream. It's all about that. It was the same with prostitution. Interesting enough, that it was while it was a sunset industry, an illegal industry, it naturally attracted organised crime. Initially, certainly, once it was legitimised, it took the gangs out of it, although I am reliably informed they're now back in. Interesting enough.
Fred, a question at the back.
Yeah, excuse me. It's more aimed at Gregg, but I'd like the American gentleman to ask it. Has the sea change come about because the organisations involved have actually seen that there is no victim with possession and use of cannabis?
So the question is about the changing political landscape, and I guess has the public are police moving because the public mood is shifting?
Look, it's really interesting, and with Kris, listen to Kris. He's look, cannabis is a non-issue. You're probably sitting there, Kris, thinking, what are these people still talking about cannabis? We've moved on from them a long time ago. With cannabis, I mean, the reality of it is illegal, and it's our people are, as I say, a little more prescriptive. The reason I put those stats up there was, if you looked at it purely, the fact that we're now this huge reduction in the number of people being charged with cannabis, you would have thought by itself, as the lead on TV1 was, where you've got de facto decriminalisation. That's not the case. If you wander down Courtney Place smoking on a Saturday night, you'll still get arrested. You'll go back, but you just won't be charged. You'll still have your weed taken off you, and you'll still be charged. So far as that goes, attitude-wise, again, I go back to what I said about, you know, the under 40s. The fact that we put that article, well, we didn't put it, it was the frontline police officer put that article in there about thinking it's time to move on. We've had no letters. I went before I came here and asked my editor, have we had any letters to the editor from that, from irate members? And nothing. In fact, the individual has said that he's sit and listened to conversations around the station around it, and it's ho-hum, shrug. So I think societally, but and again, I'll go so far as I'm probably a surprise as to none of the political parties have seen this as a something that they as a showstopper, as a vote winner. I think probably even, I know in this room probably people won't think about it, even mainstream, when I bring it up in front of groups of people, that yeah, it's a non-issue. So we're reflective of that.
So, well, a related question to what Dactor's alluding to, the Prime Minister's response to a public opinion poll and general public debate around, which does seem to support what your frontline police officer was saying, that the public are comfortable with this. One of the things that our Prime Minister said, and I will put you on the spot, sorry Greg, but our Prime Minister said in response to the poll that showed the level of public support, and he and repeated by other politicians said, well, police are turning a blind eye to this anyway. We don't need to change the law. Police are turning a blind eye to this anyway. Do you have from a police officer's perspective, do you have a sense about is it okay that government devolve policy-making responsibilities to police, or at what point should government step up and say, well, if this is the reality on the ground for some people, acknowledging that not everyone gets the discretion, if this is the reality, then maybe the law should change to reflect that reality?
Two things. One of them is these governments poll incessantly. So you can guarantee whatever John Key is saying, it's from recommendations from the pollsters. Like Helen Clark before him, that's where they go. The second point I'll make about John Key, he said that before the IPCA report came out. And the IPCA report shows that the percentage of the pre-charge warnings that are cannabis related would indicate that there is no change. It's just the only time is that you're not entering the criminal justice system. So police activity, you would argue, hasn't changed much at all. That was why I was quite interested today to try and get the figures of actually the amounts seized, and the only ones I could get. And it looks like it's business as usual everywhere, but from going from pre-charge warning from the station, instead of having to turn up and Wednesday afternoon court or whenever you choose or chosen to go to court, it looks like, if you look at the stats, that's all that's changed at the moment.
Got time for one last question, again at the back there.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah, my question is for you, Greg. Do you have any statistics around people who are arrested, and I know we're talking about cannabis, but I'm actually more interested in synthetic cannabis, because I've noticed that a lot of the clients that I've had are now presenting with synthetic cannabis problems, and we all know it's not cannabis. But do you have any statistics based around that?
So the question is around statistics relating to arrests or convictions around synthetic cannabis. And Kris, again, you're from a growing up state in America. You may not know what synthetic cannabis is.
Look, it's interesting how our members, we've got very good communication from our members. They tell us what the problem is, and I like to think that when methamphetamine, I go through these issues around child abuse, we've found these from our members when they get frustrated by the whole policy. It takes so long to get through the system. And prior to the change in the law around synthetic cannabis, I was getting hassled whenever I went out and says, what are we doing? This stuff is really, particularly those in the youth area, it was a real issue. People were presenting at the watch houses with sort of real behavioural problems. They were getting complaints from parents, and this stuff's legal, we can't do anything about it. When it changed, that stopped overnight. And the reason it stopped overnight is it was a legitimate industry. All the people who were involved in the industry were there legitimately. So when it became illegal for them to do what they were doing, they stopped doing it because they were legitimate people. And actually the supply really dried up pretty much overnight, and it really didn't appear on our radar. My understanding, and again it's anecdotal, I don't have the statistics, but certainly anecdotally it is starting to reappear, and it's reappearing for another reason, drug testing. Because I have a colleague who's a contractor. He goes on a site to do it, but he's now got to sign a contract that says you will drug test your staff, and not only that, if any of them have tested positive in the last 12 months, they will not come on our site. So what's actually happening is that people now are moving back to synthetic cannabis because, on my understanding, some of it can be detected, but because of the ever-changing formula used, it often will go through. So that's and nothing's ever as it seems. And one thing you learn as a trained detective, you look at something, what does this mean? What is something's changed here? A whole pile of things could have changed it. A little bit your explanation around why we fluctuate with the cannabis seizures. Weather.
Dennis, at the back there. Final question, sir.
I need you to translate again because I can't speak both of those languages. I'll try my best. I was just interested in what you were saying about the police opening up a third door for people. You know what I'm talking about? Can you translate that? Well, I'm just saying, is it only police that refer them to that third door, or
Sure.
and other organisations or drug?
So
Can they be part? You understand?
Yeah.
What language is?
Yeah. So Kris, the question is around the referrals to lead. Is it? You touched on this slightly, but is it just police officers? Can people self-refer? Can other agencies refer people to the health interventions?
So I'll answer that in two ways. The short answer, real quick, is that that right now people can self-refer and community members can refer, but it needs to be vetted by a law enforcement official. And the reason for that is because what we would love to see at the end is that we would have treatment on demand and social services on demand. Well, we are not at that point yet, and so we're afraid of being completely flooded. And so what we're actually looking for is individuals who are either known to police officers or to community members or business owners as actually being involved in the drug trade in a public space. So that is the limitation. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my attempt at it.
So it sounds like you still have same challenges that we have around lack of access to treatment. What I think we're experiencing now in New Zealand is a lot of people wanting help and a real high threshold to get that help, whether it's waiting lists or no services in that region. So that's one of the attractiveness to any kind of law reform or a system like LEAD is that resources might follow. That if we are going to take a public health approach, then government, because one thing, we do like what you've done in your state, but we have a thing called publicly funded healthcare. You should try it sometime. If we do this, if the government is true around their claims that this is a health approach that needs health responses, then at some point the money needs to flow, and it's not yet. There is and I'm not picking on you, Gregg, but police receive more money for drug law enforcement than all alcohol and drug treatment combined. So we still have the mismatch, and we think one of the ways to break that is to change the law. The money follows the law, and if you change the law, then the money might actually start being channeled to health interventions, whether it's early prevention, early intervention, and so on, or high quality treatment services, harm reduction, and so on. So can I thank? So that was me summing up. Just like how I did that. Can I thank first the audience, those of you who have attended all three of these sessions. It's great to see you again. To the new folks, it's great that you've come along. This was the final speaker in suit for this year. We will have our annual general meeting near the end of November, so we'll send you the dates and information for that. You'll also get a note from us soon seeking feedback. We like holding these sessions for as long as you like coming to these sessions. And someone, can I say, we're very responsive to feedback. Someone complained about our old projector was a bit shit. Do you like our new one? Eh? It's brighter, it's up higher. We can see Kris. We've exploited our new projector because we can see Kris nice and clearly there. So we are a very responsive organisation. But thank you for coming. And finally, can I thank Gregg and Kris. It was great to have you. Kris beamed him all the way. I'm thinking we need to get you to New Zealand and and spread the good news of Lead. I think it's a winner. And Sir, it's good to have you maybe in the last time you're wearing your hat at a Drug Foundation event as the president of the association. We'll see you again when you're no longer president, and I don't know, will you be wearing jeans and t-shirt and jandals and
Who knows what
free,
the fun of my t-shirt.
free, that's right. Support, don't punish t-shirt. But thank you all, everybody. Thanks, Kris. I'm going to hang up on you now and I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
See ya.